Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to Let's Have Renaissance, a podcast about writing, editing, publishing, literature, the arts, and more. I am Ito Utini.
And I'm Makaya Utini, and today we're speaking with Derrick Austin. Derrick is a poet and ekphrastic writer with 2 poetry collections published and a 3rd in progress, all with BOA Editions. He holds an MFA from the University of Michigan and has been a Cave Canem Fellow, an Amy Lowell Poetry Traveling Scholar, a winner of the Isabella Gardner Poetry Award, and a winner of the Poulin Jr. Poetry Prize, among others. We're excited to be with him today.
Thank you for tuning in. We're excited that you're here. Why don't you also subscribe, like, comment, and share this episode with your friends?
And if you know anyone who wants to come on the podcast, please do send them our way. Also, if you haven't yet, sign up for our free newsletter where we share updates, resources, and opportunities. To support the podcast, you can make a one-time donation through our website or purchase a subscription to our blog where you'll find more premium content and resources at thedatekeepers.com. Thank you for being a part of our community.
Derrick, thank you so much for joining us. We're excited to have you. Can you please tell us about yourself?
Yes, thank you for having me. I'm excited for our conversation. I'm primarily a poet who writes a lot about visual art, about queerness, about love and desire, about the landscape and history. I've been writing primarily poetry for the past, 16 years, which is wild. I've written 3 collections of poetry. Trouble the Water is my first collection, and then Tenderness, and then my most recent collection will be out this May, which is called This Elegance, and they're all from BOA Editions. And I'm really invested also lately in trying my hand at nonfiction. And so lately I have been interested in the question of what does ekphrasis or writing about visual art look like in prose. And so my latest venture is sort of mixing personal essay with art criticism, as well as writing craft essays about poets whose practice is highly influenced by visual art. And so that's a little bit about me and my artistic practice.
Can you tell us what makes a poetry collection?
And also, how do you choose which poems to put together? How do you know when you've got a collection versus maybe 2 or 3 collections?
Yeah, that's always the question, right? Is when am I finished with the collection? So I primarily write poem to poem. So I don't usually have a grand outline for my collection. I don't know in advance what the shape will be. I have some themes and ideas that I'm interested in exploring, but I never really think about the book in a conscious way while I'm writing my individual poems. I feel like that frees me up from the stress and pressure of having to, put a book together. And if I focus just on one poem at a time, it makes the process infinitely easier for me. And it also allows me to be playful in my writing process, right? If I have a fixed idea of what my collection will be, it might foreclose possibilities for other kinds of poems to emerge. And so that's one reason why I like to focus on one poem at a time. And I usually wait until I have about 50 or so pages of poems. That's around the space where I start thinking that I might have a collection. And from there, it's mostly a process of seeing how the poems speak to each other, seeing what sort of obsessions, what ideas, what kind of language emerges between the poems. Organizing collections is really stressful for me, to be honest. I have so many poet friends who are really intuitive about ordering their collections, and they're able to sort of see the poems on the ground and come up with these interesting connections. But for me, I feel like it's a much more sort of linear and cerebral process. At least it was for my first 2 books. My first 2 books are organized into sections, which are usually organized around a theme or around a tone. And with my next book, This Elegance, it's my first collection where I don't have any section breaks at all. So it's all just here's a suite of poems. And I decided to do that because I wanted to challenge myself and see if I could make a book in a different shape. And a lot of the poems in this collection emerge out of the past 6 years and the sort of tumult of the COVID pandemic and all the political unrest. And so it felt emotionally true to not have any kinds of section breaks, since the sort of, at least my sense of time in the past 6 years has completely dissolved. What year is it? What day is it? How am I feeling in one moment to another is, completely up in the air. And so with this latest book, I really was interested in sort of immersing the reader into that mind space. So those are some things that I think about as I'm ordering collections.
You mentioned that you've been writing poetry for the last 16 years. Did you choose poetry or poetry chose you? Because it's a really tough field to, succeed and thrive in.
It really is. There really is no valor or money in poetry at all. But I love it. I feel like poetry chose me in a really interesting way. When I was a kid, I'd always had dreams of being a writer. I had loved reading since I was a young kid, but I imagined that I would write fiction because that's primarily what I read. I didn't start reading poetry until I was in high school. And one day I read a poem and I remembered the visceral feeling that I had. It really felt like lightning had struck the back of my head when I finished reading this poem. And I knew that poetry was an avenue I needed to pursue. But as far as, making a living, it's tough. I've been fortunate in that I was able to go to an MFA program that was fully funded. And so that provided a lot of time to write. That enabled me to finish my first poetry collection. And with that collection out in the world in 2016, it really enabled me to apply to other opportunities. I've mostly been able to sort of live on creative writing fellowships. And, those are boom and bust years, but, it's a very precarious existence. It's a lot of luck, it's a lot of hard work, and frankly, it's a lot of help from my friends and my community. So it's kind of cobbling a life together.
And what was that first poem?
So it's it's not a particularly fancy choice. Alicia Keys had a book of poems that came out decades ago, and I bought that because I loved her album. And it was a poem in that book of hers, and I forget what the title was, but I just remember the sensation that came over me. Like I had never experienced a poem that spoke to me in such a visceral kind of way. But Alicia Keys is to thank for my writing career.
And you said you've been with BOA Editions for 3 books now, and that's usually a pretty good sign. So what's that working relationship been like, and how did you first get connected with them? What's the editorial process with them like?
So for a lot of poets, the primary method of getting our first books published is through submitting to presses for contests or for open reading periods. And when I was a graduate student, I sent to as many prizes and open reading periods as I could, including BOA Editions, whose first book prize is the Poulin Jr. Poetry Prize. And the year that I had submitted my manuscript was the year that Mary Shebist was judging. And part of the reason why I sent to BOA, in addition to the roster of poets that they had published that I had really loved, like Lucille Clifton and Bridget Begin Kelly, I had read Mary Shebist's most recent book called Incarnadine, which is an incredible book that meditates on the Virgin Mary in religious history, in popular history, and in her own personal life. And my first book was really in conversation with religious art and with the Bible. And so I figured that, maybe Mary would be interested in the collection, and she was, and she picked that book. And yeah, I've stuck with BOA ever since. I was fortunate for them to be interested in publishing my second book, and I love collaborating with BOA. They have been so supportive of me from the jump. They've championed my work. They've been really open with communication. Whenever I've had a question about the process, they've always been prompt and direct. And working with the editor, Peter Connors, has been such a gift. He really understands what I'm after as a poet. He gives me the space to experiment and play around. And he also is a really helpful outside reader. A lot of the finishing touches for all three of my books has come out of advice that he's given me. And that's been such a gift and that's been such a joy. And so that's a bit of my working history with BOA.
That's great to hear.
And I'm curious, I'd like to hear more about the nonfiction that you're working on. How did you start working on nonfiction? How did you decide that that was the next step that you were going to take? And how has that been going for you?
Yeah, so I started working on this project last year as I was finishing up this Elegance. That collection was basically done by the spring, and I had all this time suddenly creatively, and I wanted to keep writing, but I knew that poems probably weren't the thing that I was interested in writing at the time. And I wanted to challenge myself and see if I could write prose. Like I mentioned before, visual art is really important to me as a poet, and I've written primarily ekphrastic poetry as opposed to prose about visual art. And I feel like I had sort of hit a limit with ekphrastic poetry. So I'm really interested in what ekphrasis can do and look like in prose. So like I mentioned earlier, I'm really interested in writing that blurs the boundary between the personal essay and art criticism. So I'm influenced by writers like Hilton Als and his book White Girls, or Anne Carson and her book Decreation, or Plain Water. Also thinking about Christina Sharp's book Ordinary Notes, which is incredible. Robert Walser is a writer who I really love, who was a late 19th, early 20th century Swiss writer who wrote all kinds of things, fiction, short stories, novels, and also nonfiction. And there's a book of his collected art writing called Looking at Pictures that I've had on me for over a decade at this point. You know, wherever I've moved, I always keep it with me because he's such a fascinating art writer. He'll have pieces that are straightforward art criticism where he'll go to an exhibit and talk about what he sees, or he'll do these really experimental takes where he'll sort of write art criticism from the voices of the figures in the paintings. He has a really beautiful piece that's about a painting of David and Saul from the Bible, of David playing the harp for Saul. And it starts as like a description of the two of them, and then suddenly the harp starts speaking in the essay. And so like that kind of surprise is really what I'm interested in with this art criticism. And so I was working over the past year on this long essay about Manet. I was living abroad for a year a couple of years ago, and I spent some time in Paris, and I went to the Musée d'Orsay for the first time. And I saw these two still lifes by Manet that I really loved and I found really moving, in part because they reminded me about certain lessons about poetry that I keep close to my heart, about the importance of images and details and the sort of psychological nuances that they have. And so I thought that I was going to write an essay about the still lives, but then it sort of blossomed into this longer essay about Manet's relationship to the Black figure in his work, thinking specifically about Olympia and the Black model in the back of that painting. And so it's an essay thinking about that aspect of Manet's work and also thinking about my relationship to audience as a Black writer, sort of thinking about the demands that I want to put on my audience and sort of thinking about my relationship to other Black writers who are really important to me. And so that's one aspect of the art writing project that I'm doing right now. I'm also working on craft essays about poets who write in conversation with visual art. And so I had a piece published in American Poetry Review last year about Robert Hayden, who was the first Black poet laureate of the US. And so I wrote about his ekphrastic poetry and their sort of conversation with the grotesque and thinking about isolation and sort of figures who live at the margins. And I'm also working on these prose poems that have been published in a few journals, including in Poem a Day. But yeah, I'm really excited by the work. And I just finished an art criticism fellowship that has been really helpful. And I wrote an essay about Patrick McCoy, who is a a Black queer photographer based in Chicago. And so I wrote about a suite of his photos that are on display at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, and sort of thinking about the way that McCoy navigates questions of intimacy and privacy among his subjects, who are primarily Black men, often Black queer men. And so that piece will be out in a couple of weeks. But yeah, it's really thrilling. I found that I love writing nonfiction more than I thought I would. But yeah.
We always ask our guests to read. Do you have anything you would like to share with us?
Sure, I'd be happy to read some poems. So I'll read two short poems from this elegance. And the first poem that I'm going to read is called Diary, and it's part of a series of poems in the book that are also called Diary. I had a teacher who assigned me the task of writing a diary poem about my life. She said to, write a poem in 7 sections for each day of the week. And that first version was terrible. It was awful. So that doesn't exist anywhere. But I did keep that lesson really close because I was really interested in thinking about the diary as a form of intimacy. And so this poem is Diary. 3 months since moving into Jay's apartment. Sun over red and white pine. It's early Monday morning. My fever broke. For 3 days, I barely moved. The sheets smelled chemically floral. The radiator fumed. Jay fed me broth from an earthenware bowl. The last time I was bedridden, I was a boy whose only wish was to live in one place. My family lived where the government sent my father. I was the sergeant's boy. I was very good at memorizing capitals. In Berlin, we saw Anita Baker perform songs my parents played on mornings I had to mow the lawn or scrub the toilet. I'm embarrassed by pictures of me at that age, blank behind the eyes, my mind wandering. My heart had nowhere to be. Watching Jay sleep, I imagine slipping on my clothes and taking my camera to the plaza, where retired sailors under stout trees play dominoes or chess with weighted pieces. Instead, I will put away dishes, sweep the floor. No one has dated me as long as Jay, openly, patiently. His stillness reminds me of looking down at the sea from a cliff.
Very nice.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So the second poem is a sonnet, which is a form that I've been really interested in across all 3 of my books. This poem is called Gig Economy. Cutting my own hair saves money, better put toward a bill. I look presentable enough in virtual meetings, a genial blur. Invoices, empty correspondence. I'm not clever, wearing this mask of inflexible competence. I live in bed, where I work and eat poorly while I work and dream. If I died now in arrears and here of all places, mattress, office, psych ward, coffin, I'll never have cared for a house cat of my own. Uppity, mercurial, impish, soft, private, unbothered. So human-like in his affections and strangeness, a companion named Sargent, with twitchy, sensitive ears, even at rest, who could mourn a little before biting my dead face to survive.
That's great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a delight. This has been a wonderful conversation. I always love hopping on a podcast. I'm a big listener of podcasts. I love, listening to all kinds of podcasts in my day-to-day life. I love this sort of back and forth, the sort of casualness that allows for really interesting kinds of conversations to emerge. I love listening to a podcast where the writer kind of drifts and we get a sense of who they are outside of the work, or get a sense of them in a way that we might not have in a strictly print interview. And so I'm always thankful to folks like you guys who are doing this kind of work to talk to writers and artists and thinkers and giving us a different way of expressing ourselves and talking about the work.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for being part of
Thank you
it.
for being part of it. So, yeah.
Congrats on the upcoming book.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Keep it up. Have a great day.
Thanks. You too.
Bye-bye.